Hi, my name is Jeff Brewster. I'm a retired research scientist, and I'd like to talk about election fraud claims that were presented in two YouTube videos in November. I did some preliminary studies that were reported in an earlier video. I'd like to complete those studies here. These claims were presented by four engineers led by Dr. Shiva Ayyadurai. And they claim the election fraud was large enough to almost swing the state of Michigan and possibly the U.S. presidential election. So they're quite extraordinary claims. The authors presented a detailed fraud mechanism and two mathematical methods that they used to detect fraud using precinct-level election data. I'm going to term them the Evans method and the Applegate method. I believe those were the gentlemen who developed them. This is a summary of their findings. The white areas are the first video, and the yellow areas are the second. So their first study was 4 counties in Michigan. 3 were classified as fraudulent, and a total of 138,000 votes were affected. So the second video, they introduced a second fraud detection method and used it to confirm their evaluation of these races. They also introduced 2 additional races as controls, as example of normal Evans plots. So I've found this to be the most credible fraud claim that I've seen in 2020. Virtually all the others are pretty easily dismissed. It has been critiqued by a number of people. In my view, some of those critiques are based on a misunderstanding of what Ayyadurai et al. Are trying to say, and the other ones are not complete. They don't address every aspect of this claim, I don't believe. So I'm going to try to do a more complete evaluation, and I'm approaching this as I would a scientific peer review, a technical presentation. I'm going to presume it's valid and try to show clearly and objectively why it's not, if I can find that to be true. So my initial response to that data was that they had not enough of negative controls, and the ones they did have were not similar to the suspect races in terms of demographics and political mix. Obviously, there's no positive control because there's no known U.S. election with massive fraud. But lacking those, they should have ideally done some kind of independent confirmation of their findings, which they didn't do. So initially, I had 2 goals. Look at those negative control rates, look at additional negative control data, and make sure that this classification is accurate. And secondly, to look at the suspect data with some other methodology and try to independently confirm their results and conclusions. In the course of that, I became interested in the math of their method and trying to determine how specific it is to fraud. So, very important to get this terminology straight. There does seem to be some confusion with some of the critics. A party line vote is a vote at the top of the ballot, typically, that you make one choice and it selects all the candidates of that party in all the races. The alternative way to vote is to vote directly for each candidate. And I'm going to use the term partitioning to define how, say, the Democrats in a given precinct split their vote between party and direct, and the same for the Republicans. So this is the data that one has to work with, just a table. Each precinct, you get the total party votes for each party, the total votes for each candidate, and the direct votes are just the difference between the total and the party. So the authors presented a detailed mechanism, and it involves a number of features. So primary feature is that Trump votes are converted to Biden votes after the paper ballots are scanned by some sort of malware or hidden setting in the scanner software. Paper votes are not altered. This algorithm is run on all the scanners, both the precinct ones election day and the central scanners for the mail-in votes. Only direct votes for Trump are affected. So party line votes are not affected, and direct votes for other candidates in the election, like Senate, House, etc., are not affected. So this means those other races could be used as negative controls, and they're really ideal at the same time, the same place, the same voters. The conversion of votes is not uniform or random. It's proportional to the percent of the Republican vote in each precinct. So there's a distinct pattern to this conversion, and you can calculate the number of votes. So I think Phil Evans came up with a pretty clever approach to use that data, the raw election data, to try to calculate fraud. So first he said, let's group the voters by how they vote. So all the party line voters, Democrats and Republicans in one group, all the direct voters in the other group. And let's assume that the voter behavior is more or less the same in both groups. So if 60% of the party line voters vote for Trump, you'd expect 60% of the direct votes to be for Trump. And since this is not affected by fraud and this is affected by fraud, a difference could indicate fraud. It could just indicate candidate preference, but it's possibly fraud. To elucidate the mechanism, you would plot those differences in each precinct versus the percent Republican in that precinct. And if this theory is correct, then you should get a straight line with a negative slope. So the fraud should increase as the percent Republican increases. So let me show that kind of graphically here. The green would be a normal situation where the difference between the direct and party percentages is on average equal, so it's 0 with some statistical fluctuations. This would be an example of a uniform fraud, about 7% in all precincts. It could also indicate a uniform, is what you'd expect if there was just a preference difference for Trump versus other Republican candidates. And this is what you would expect to see if the fraud theory of theirs is true. So more fraud occurs in more Republican precincts. I just want to point out then this data is sorted according to percent Republicanism, and that's obviously important to bring out this mechanistic relationship. If you sorted it just on precinct name or something, this would just look random and you'd lose that information. So here's an actual Evans plot for one of the suspect races, and this is what's represented now as a normal plot. And I should say now in the first video, they just said normal was a horizontal line centered on 0, as I showed earlier. In the second video, they presented this as an example of normal without a lot of discussion or explanation. So again, my first goal was to look at their methods and get some control data and look at that. So again, here's the Oakland County. I've shown a lot of that data earlier, so I'm just going to show some new data from Oakland County. This is the 2020 suspect race. This is the 2016 race, which Trump lost, but by a much smaller margin. And there's very little difference in those two sets of data. Similarly for 2012 and 2008, very similar pattern in the Evans plots. And those almost certainly were not fraudulent. So with this new data combined with the data I've looked at earlier, you can say that almost universally the Evans plot says there's fraud, with the sole exception of the Saginaw County data. I didn't get this data from an additional county, St. Clair, which is somewhat larger than Saginaw. It's a little more representative of the suspect races. And that's classified as fraudulent by Evans, but normal by Applegate. So this first goal, first study does not show good agreement between the observations and the predictions of the authors. So now I'm going to try to look at confirming their results in the suspect races. It's separate methods. And these are derivatives of the Evans approach. I'm going to call this one the Brewster method, for lack of a better term. Both of these methods are based on comparing a test race and a control race. So I'm not using that party line versus direct comparison. My predictor is a control race, and my indicator is the test race. So this approach uses direct votes. So it's kind of limited to two different candidates in the same race. So President and Senate, for example, President and House. And it still has the weakness of requiring this data, which isn't present in a lot of data sets. The second approach just uses the total votes, the percentage of total votes for your test candidate versus the total votes for a control candidate. For example, we can compare Trump in 2 different years, and it's more general. So this is the Brewster plot and the differential plot for Oakland County 2020. Very similar general appearance. Both have a negative average value that's the same as the percentage of vote, the difference in the percentage of votes that Trump got versus the Senate candidate. But they had no deterministic variation. There's no indication of that change in vote difference with percent Republican. And here I'm using this party fraction of the party vote that Evans uses as the sorter. Here's a year-to-year differential comparison for 2 different counties, and again, pretty much a random pattern, a slight negative average value, and no evidence of a deterministic variation. So the quantity of lost votes, potentially fraudulent votes, is considerably smaller and sometimes different in sign than you'd get from the Evans plot. And the pattern is obviously completely different and consistent with voter preference rather than fraud, or at least this fraud scheme. So that's another blow against the validity of these Evans plots as effective ways of detecting fraud. So why doesn't it work? I mean, the assumptions seem reasonable. The theory behind it seems logical, and it should give a mechanism. The mechanism is consistent with the pattern that they show from the Evans plots. There's no obvious issue with the math. So what's going on? So that brings up this third goal. And to do this, we're going to have to get into the math a little more. So I need some nomenclature so I can compactly and accurately define all the different quantities that we're going to look at. So candidate is represented by an uppercase letter. A is all. Type of vote is indicated by a lowercase letter. Total would be the sum of these two. And again, partitioning is an important consideration here, so that would be defined as the number of party line votes for one of the parties divided by the total votes for that party. And let me just formalize some other terms related to the Evans method, because they also apply to these other methods I developed. From the raw data, you identify some function or relationship that is sensitive to fraud. And I'm going to term that the indicator. You identify some other function or relationship that's not affected by fraud, but can give an estimate of the indicator when there's no fraud. And you take the difference between those two, and that is the signal. And that signal is proportional to the quantity of votes that are lost or potentially fraudulent. And to reveal the mechanism, you need some sorter function, and then you have an output that's the signal versus the sorter, and then that output can be classified into fraudulent or normal categories. All right, here I'm trying to present the same simple model that they gave, the Ayyadurai gave in the first video, a model precinct. So we have equal numbers of Democrats and Republicans. The partitioning is the same for both parties. So here's the Democrats, here's the Republicans, same number of votes, equal party and direct percentages. So let's take 10 direct votes from the Republican side and transfer them to the Democratic side. We get this situation. The percent Republican has obviously changed. The predictor has not changed. So this ratio has not changed, so that's fixed. And this ratio has changed, so the indicator changes, and the difference between the two gives a signal. Let me take this same starting situation again, and this time we'll just change the way the Democrats partition their votes. So now only 30% vote party. Again, no transfer of votes, so the true percentage of Republican votes is still 50%, but that predictor now increases and the indicator decreases. And so since we have a change with opposite sign, we get the difference between them is a large false positive signal simply from changing the partitioning of the Democrats. You flip that partitioning and you get an opposite false signal. So in the previous slide, the predictor stayed the same with fraud, and the percent Republican changed. In this case, that change is opposite. Now, is this going to be a problem in real life, or are the most precincts pretty much have the same partitioning between the Democrats and Republicans? Well, no, this is Saginaw County, and this is pretty representative. And basically, the Republicans tend to vote about 60% party line across all the precincts, whereas the Democrats have a very large variation. They tend to vote high percentage party line in the Democratic precincts and low percentage party line in the Republican precincts. So we're going to expect this imbalance in most precincts and therefore expect a significant false fraud signal. Just want to go back to that first model and add a little data about partitioning. So again, the initial partitioning was 50% for each party. And this is what I'm going to call the actual partitioning. This is what you would see on the paper ballots before the fraud occurred. After the fraud, these are the numbers we would see in the observed data. So fraud produces a change in the partitioning. So rather than look at a bunch of those individual scenarios, let me try to simulate a bunch of them at once. I'm just going to create a spreadsheet that takes in values of the percent Republican, in this case the total percent Republican in each precinct, not the party fraction. I'm going to specify a partitioning for each precinct, for each party, and I'm going to specify a fraud level that applies to all the precincts. So this means this is a percentage of the direct vote that is transferred, that is then multiplied by the percent Republican in that precinct, and that gives you the percentage of direct vote that's transferred in the precinct. And then just calculate all these other outputs and have a look at those. So here's that spreadsheet. Here's the parameters that define the partitioning distribution. This defines the fraud level. This defines the total number of voters. And you have windows that show the results. Here's that table down below. Here's just fixed percent Republican for each precinct for this model system. Here's where you can calculate the partitioning for each precinct based on the parameters above. And these cells calculate all the values that are displayed. All right, so going back to the first simple model, no fraud, equal numbers of Dems and Republicans in each precinct, and the partitioning is the same for both parties. So there's no signal, and the input and output, so the input and output partitioning is the same. Let's add some fraud to that system, and you get a nice linear response from these signaling methods, the signals from those methods. And you see a displacement between the input partitioning and the output. For the Republicans, you get a constant positive displacement. For the Dems, you get a varying negative displacement. What's notable is that at low Republican, or ideally zero Republican, the Democratic partitioning is the same as the actual partitioning, whereas the Republican partitioning has this constant offset. So you can get at least a guess at what the true partitioning is for the Democrats at that end. All right, no fraud. And this is that situation where we just have a change in the partitioning for the Democrats, leaving the Republicans at 50-50. And this is that false fraud artifact. And since the fraud's zero, the input and output partitioning is the same. All right, flip that partitioning over so it's 70% party for the Democrats, and the sign of that artifact changes. And notice there's no artifact for those other two methods. All right, now add fraud, and that artifactual response is added to the straight line fraud response, and this is the net result for the Evans method. The differential method stays linear. There's some slight nonlinearity in the Brewster response. And again, now that there's fraud, you see the displacement in the input and output partitioning. All right, let me go back to no fraud, but we'll have a more realistic partitioning, more similar to the Saginaw partitioning. And now this anomalous response looks like this. And if we add fraud to that, then again, it's the addition of the anomalous response and the linear fraud response. So again, what you see is that fraud distorts the partitioning distribution, so that the observed distribution is not the same as the actual distribution that's on the paper ballots. On the other hand, with no fraud, a varying partitioning distribution can produce this false fraud signal. So it's not clear whether the observed Evans fraud signal is real or is just an artifact of the way the voters vote in each precinct. So this is a chicken or egg problem, really. So I'll call the chicken hypothesis the one there's fraud. The actual partitioning is sort of constant, more or less, and the varying distribution that is observed is just a side effect of the fraud. The alternative hypothesis is there's no fraud, that the observed partitioning distribution is the actual partitioning distribution, and since it varies, it produces a fraud signal as a side effect of that variation. I'm going to try to resolve that question by simulating data for those two situations and seeing which one fits the observed values better. So I'm going to modify that simulator so that I have the actual observed percent Republican values for each precinct. I'm going to use those same inputs, fraud level and partitioning distribution. And I'm going to calculate outputs for the Evans signal, the predictor, and the partitioning data. So that spreadsheet now looks something like this. I've got the same fields to input fraud and partitioning information, and I've got three windows that now plot the observed Evans signal, the calculated Evans signal, the observed and calculated partitioning data, and the observed and actual Evans parameter. And down below these are all the cells that do the calculations for the hundreds of precincts. Let me blow up that area again. So here I have error terms. So for each individual output. So for the Evans plot, for each precinct, I'll calculate the difference between the calculated and actual Evans response for that precinct. I'll square that difference so that it's a positive number, and then sum up all the differences for all the precincts. And that sum is in this cell. So to get the best fit to the Evans data, I want to make this number as small as possible. Same thing for these other responses. This cell contains the These are termed the residuals. This contains the total residuals that ideally I want to minimize all of these, get the best fit to all of these. But I do have the option of just picking one or some combination, adding some combination of these, say if I just want to fit the Evans data. That's a possibility. So again, I'm going to use the observed values of %R. I'm going to guess some initial values for the fraud and partitioning information, and I'm going to try to get the best fit by adjusting those values. So initially I do this manually to try to at least get values that are more or less close, and then I have a very simple program that runs that just tweaks each of these input parameters and adjust it in the direction that makes the error smaller until I'm not getting any further, I'm not minimizing any further. So once the best fit is determined, then the plan is to evaluate the outputs, look at the goodness of fit, and also look at the plausibility of the various parameters that are determined. It is possible in these kind of simulations to converge to some mathematical minimum, but it produces results that aren't very realistic. So we do need to do a reality check. That problem usually occurs when your initial guesses are far off from the true values, and then you can converge to some false minimum. So we do need to have good guesses initially, and this presents some problem for me because here's the Evans plot. In my simulations, the fraud level should be the same, it's the variation in the fraud from 0% Republican to 100% Republican. So is it 65% that I see here, or am I supposed to just ignore that and only look at the negative deviation? So this kind of large positive deviation has never been explained by Ayyadurai et al. And we've really never specified exactly how they calculate the number of votes for that matter. These are some details that they've never gone into. So I'm going to start my simulation with 60% fraud. And what I found was that the error in this parameter was extremely large. This was the dominant error. And I simply couldn't let this automatic program run. What happens is it very quickly reduces the fraud level to 0. So this parameter is this fit is very sensitive to fraud level, not very sensitive to partitioning, whereas these two are about equally sensitive to the fraud level and the partitioning. So the only way to get any kind of fit at a high fraud level was to freeze the fraud level, to ignore this fit, and just try to get the best fit to these two sets of outputs. And doing that, so this represents the best fit then, with those limitations. So we get a partitioning distribution that's more or less constant for both parties, but very high for the Democrats, very low for the Republicans, and not a terrible fit to the Evans signal. I go with that other guess at the fraud level, say roughly 25%. I do have the same issue. This fit is better, but it's still a pretty large error term. And again, if I include that error term in the residuals that I'm trying to minimize, it very quickly tries to take the fraud level to a low level. So again, I had to omit this data from the fit and freeze the fraud level at 25, and then this is the best fit to these parameters. And now we have somewhat different partitioning. Again, the Republicans are more or less now the Republicans stay constant, the Democrats are shifting down. And finally, if I just try to fit all the data together and let the program find the true minimum, this is what you get. So essentially 0 fraud gives a very good fit to all these observed values. And a partitioning distribution that now, since there's no fraud, it's the input and the output partitioning are the same, and it's similar to what we've seen from Saginaw County. Have exactly the same issue with the Kent County data, cannot get a good fit unless I let the fraud level go to virtually 0. And the same thing with the Saginaw County. So the best fit is essentially zero fraud. So to summarize that, with 25% fraud, you do get a good fit to some of the data, but a very poor fit to the Evans parameter. And the average difference between the Democrats and Republicans is 16%. With the AIG, the zero fraud hypothesis, get very good fits to everything and a basically 1% difference in the average behavior. So these are these plausible partitioning distributions? I guess so. This does indicate that overall the Democrats are quite different than the Republicans here. It's at least the average is the same. It's just varying for the Democrats. So I have a theory about why that partitioning might be that way. Why is it constant for the Republicans and varying for the Democrats? If you look at Kent County, and you look at the races that had a party affiliation, so judges or bond issues, et cetera, are excluded. 89 out of 89 of those races had a Republican candidate. Only 46 had a Democratic candidate. Macomb County is a similar, not quite that extreme, but almost all the races had a Republican candidate. Only 2/3 had a Democratic candidate. So Republicans can vote party line in any precinct, in almost any precinct, and have a voice in their government. So there's no strong incentive for them to go through the work of selecting individual candidates. Just select one dot and select all the Republicans. Democrats, however, at least in their strongly Republican precincts where there's no Democratic candidates, would not have a voice if they vote party line. So they have a strong incentive to direct vote in those Republican precincts. So to me, that explains why you would see this variation, why in highly Republican precincts the Democrats would choose to vote directly most often. This also would explain the Applegate response, this very different behavior of Republican and Democratic voters. And I think it would explain that scatter in the Applegate plot, because this decision to vote party line or direct is very local. Just depends on what the local candidates in your particular area, what party, if you have a candidate in your area that is in your party. So again, and this also seems like a plausible distribution based on the behavior of this normal county. And I've also looked at Oakland over the years, and I don't see any big difference in the partitioning from the suspect race in 2020 and the presumably normal race in 2008. So to summarize, from a numerical standpoint, we have very poor fits for the fraud hypothesis. Plausible partitioning, but maybe a little less likely in my view than the partitioning that we see that's consistent with the no fraud hypothesis. And this is on a numerical basis far, far better. So on the basis of all these observations, I think that one can pretty conclusively conclude that the Evans output is not related to fraud. This is the best fit to the observed data. So to summarize this, I believe Ayyadurai et al. Provided clear, transparent descriptions of their data. They made a good faith presentation, and their methods and results seemed readily replicated, and the results were supported by their data. And they made quantitative testable predictions that could be confirmed or refuted. However, my findings indicated that their method failed to correctly classify normal control data, negative control data. Their results were not consistent with my independent analyses that did not find any pattern to the vote losses and were not consistent with the quantity of vote losses they found. And I found that the method does have some serious shortcomings. It is not specific to fraud, and it can experience severe interference from partitioning variations. On the other hand, the new methods I found do seem specific to fraud. I haven't identified any artifacts or interferences with them. And in summary, I have to say that no confidence can be placed in these methods or in the fraud claims. Before closing, I have a little bit of interesting data that I came across. So this is, again, a normal so-called Evans plot from 2016 presidential election in Macomb County. And then I looked at the Evans plot for the House data in that county. And at first I thought I had mistakenly plotted two data sets. This was some kind of error. But then I flagged those, each precinct, divided them into the House districts that they belong to. So this is the 10th House district, very strongly Republican, and this is the 9th that's strongly Democratic. And you completely resolve these two things. It's like you have two independent Evans plots. So I don't think the Evans plot indicates fraud, but it does indicate something. So this is maybe an interesting thing to try to sort out. And if you look at some Oakland County data, 2012 House race in Oakland County, you see again this kind of weird looking Evans plot. But if you sort out the different congressional districts, it begins to make a little sense. So this is 67% Republican, 55. These are 38% Republican and 21% Republican. So these are strongly Democratic, these are strongly Republican, and they do segregate in an Evans plot. And they do segregate in the Brewster plot as well. So maybe that tells us something about what Evans plots are actually revealing. Thank you for your attention. Any questions that you leave in the comments section, I'll do my best to answer.